Hey everybody, I am finally going home from my European trip. I'm in the Charlotte airport right now, actually seeing Rafiq Anadol's installation that's there. If you don't know who Rafiq Anadol is, you should definitely check him out. Or if you are in the Charlotte airport anytime soon, you can see his awesome installation that I've got back here going on. So while I'm waiting on my ride, let's go ahead and finish up our last two lessons that we'll have with us together. So let me go ahead and share my screen and we'll get started. Okay, so this is our last bit of art history that we're going to go through this PowerPoint in our next lesson, and it's going to be this one on 18th and 19th century artwork, specifically Western artwork, that is considered pre-modern art. So everything that we're going to see here, this is coming after the Rococo period that ended in the 1700s, and then it's going to stop at the beginning of the 1900s when modern art takes over. I've also got this little disclaimer right here. If you have not already, I would really advise you to go over to our projects folder and go into the final project folder and watch that explanation video that I have for you there. If you have already watched that, you will know that for that, you'll need to select three art periods that we have talked about through our art history unit to use for that assignment. So, the little message there, the art movements and periods that will be discussed here can all be used as collections for your final project. So if you're confused about what the collections are supposed to be, if you don't know what art periods slash movements mean when I mention them in the final project description, this is what those are. These periods, and then the ones we'll talk about in lesson 19, and then our like Rococo, our Baroque periods, our Renaissance periods, all of those are collections as well. So just be thinking about that, whatever you choose for your final project, whatever you want your theme to be. Just think about the art movements and how they could maybe fit into that theme. So we'll go ahead and get started. And this PowerPoint's a little bit different than I have them set up in the past, which is not a bad thing, but I just wanted to give you kind of a uh, what this is going to look like. So I've got our timeline here because there are many art periods that fall into the pre-modern art movement, more so than we've talked about in the past. So we're going to talk about these six that are through this timeline here. We have neoclassical that begins right after the Rococo period. It goes from 1760 to 1830. And then we have academic art. And academic art, it is sort of this own little category that's going on alongside a lot of these other periods. But it's the very like professional type of art that's being made. We'll get into them more here shortly. But really, it is, they're sort of like the elite of the art world for a long time. And it spans all throughout the 1800s. We have Romanticism, which is not about romance whatsoever. It's about a lot of feelings and emotions, but doesn't usually show itself as being in a romantic way. So, romantic art goes from 1800 to 1850. And then realism art, or 19th century realism art, as we'll kind of refer to it as, goes from the 1840s to 1870s. And just kind of like Romanticism, it ironically does not necessarily mean that it is realistic. It means that it is real, as in like the scenes being depicted are not fantasized or exaggerated. It is really how it exists. We have this little tiny movement called Pre-Raphaelite artwork, and it only goes from 1848 to 1854. It's a very specific type of art, so we'll see and look at more of that once we get there. And then lastly, we have Impressionism, which some would argue is a modern art period, but I sort of see it like the key that turns us into the modern art period, still existing in pre-modern art though. And it goes from around 1870 to 1900 is where we're going to just loosely say it stops at. So the way that we've got this set up, we've got our timeline here. So if you're looking at the PowerPoint along with this, you can, always go back to the timeline if you need to. But from there on, we are going to have this little guy here. I'm not sure if this meme is too old for you guys, but it's going to kind of be our theme throughout this. We're going to have one slide where we talk about the movement. this one's neoclassical. It starts us off, where it came from. And then the second slide that I'll show about it is going to be what it looks like. So if you're following along with skeletal notes, this might be good for you to know is that you'll have one slide for each movement dedicated to where the movement came from. And then the second slide is what it looks like or how to identify it. And that becomes really important as well. I know I'm kind of rambling a bit here before we actually get started, but it's important with these movements. We'll go back for a second. Let's see. It's important with these movements because they overlap with each other so much that you know what they look like, so that you can identify them between one another and you can differentiate them. Like, for example, romantic art might exist in the same timeline as realism art. Like there might be a painting, that is created in 1848, and you might not know, is this a romantic painting or is this a realism painting? So knowing the style, like what it would look like, that's going to help you to differentiate between if it is a romantic painting or if it is a realism painting. So hopefully that kind of makes sense to you. But as we go along, that's kind of what I want you to think about is what do these look like? How do I identify these artworks? So neoclassical art, it comes from Europe. It comes from this deep nostalgia that's had for the grandeur and glory of the Roman Empire. I know the Roman Empire is a very like TikTok trendy thing right now for some reason. But it was, very that empire, sort of set the groundwork for a lot of other things that we even have today. There is a lot that we can credit towards it. So, it's these people in the 1700s kind of reminiscing on the past in that way. It also comes from the excavation of the ruins of, I can never say it, Herculaneum and Pompeii. So that's also sort of, coinciding with the Roman Empire. And it's again this deep nostalgia for it. We start to see these artifacts from the past kind of coming, to the surface again. And lastly, it is a rebellion against the Rococo period because this follows directly after the Rococo period. And while the Rococo artists were very beautiful and pretty and like, or not the artists themselves necessarily, but the artwork coming out of it was very beautiful, very pretty, very ornate and decorative. This was sort of like, no, we want to get back to more like serious kind of art making. So the look for it, we're going to see the imagery or the subject matter, including Greek or Roman men armored with swords and spears, like in the Oath of Hirashi that we see right here on the right. We see classical subject matter from Greek and Roman history. And the figures, like the style of the subject matter, the figures always look like they're very posed, very statuesque is the word that we've got here. But it's like this doesn't feel like in the Baroque artwork we talked about how it feels very in motion. It feels like you're just like, kind of capturing a moment in time, like as it's transitioning or as it's moving. Whereas with neoclassical, it's like, we're very posed in a way that feels unnatural. And we also see a lot of sharp, clean lines in a rectangular space. So everything here feels very crisp, very, everything is very defined. It doesn't feel fuzzy or like there's any graininess to it. Everything is in like the sharpest detail it can be. Another thing, and I didn't list this here, but another thing that we notice a lot in the neoclassical artworks is that while we are elevating and really, kind of valuing these Greek and Roman like soldiers and warriors and things like that, they do depict women as well, but they're typically like very kind of shunned in the corner, like they're just sort of overcome with fear or just are not participating in the action part of it. So I think that's always kind of interesting as well that like and it also just adds to the unnatural feeling of this like, kind of war thing, like, very odd thing happening here. Very action, very aggressive. And then these women are just like in the same frame, just kind of over here, like, with their heads to the side and just like cowering. It doesn't really feel like these two things should exist in the same frame, I guess. But that's just something to kind of look for is that the women are typically depicted as being sort of shunned or just like, overcome with fear, not really in a positive light. The second type of artwork we're going to talk about is Romanticism. It's a little bit out of the timeline, but since the academic art was second, it kind of spans over this whole timeline. I'm going to talk about it next. Romanticism art, it goes from 1800 to 1850. And as I said earlier, it is not about romance. It's not really about love necessarily, but it is about emotions. It's looking beyond reason, and these artists found an inspiration in the intuition and imagination. For them, emotional value is the most important thing. So, not necessarily depicting things realistically or like how they actually exist, but in a way that exaggerates their just the naturalness of things. These are sort of known as the tortured souls of the art world. Lots of romantic art was gruesome and dark, and then they sort of fell into those emotions more so than like the lovey-dovey, emotions. It also comes in response to the Age of Reason, which was like our age of like we're looking more into like science and like logistics of things, and so this is sort of like in opposition to that. Um, in Romanticism art, we look for these dark, dramatic scenes of nature and man, usually where nature is triumphing over man. So, like in this image here, this is William Turner's painting, and it's showing this just blazing fire, kind of overtaking this city over here in an exaggerated way. This is probably not exactly how this would have existed, but Turner is really well known for kind of like making these big, like, kind of scary doomsday-ish skies, um, and exaggerating natural elements like the fire. So in this case, the nature triumphing over man, the fire is the natural element, and the man part of this, there's not like humans here, but or there is humans, they're just kind of all on the bottom right here. But it's the city that's the human-made thing that they're kind of overtaking. We also see a lot of dramatic and dark colors and values, like in the Baroque period, but with more vivid gestural brushstrokes. Whereas Baroque, like in Caravaggio's painting, everything is very crisp and clean, and you can see everything very well. But this almost goes into like an abstraction to an extent, where you kind of have to look closely to see and piece everything together because of like the looseness of the style. And like I said earlier, there is a focus on the sky typically, which is usually encompassing over half the artwork. A dark, gloomy sky could oftentimes symbolize an impending doom, and that is what's kind of happening in this case here. Okay, now academic art. Academic art comes from those who were trained by the strict standards of the French Académie des Beaux-Arts, or the Academy of Fine Arts that is found in France. Um, and this is, I don't know that I've mentioned this prior to it, but for a very long time in the Western world, France was sort of like the epicenter of the art world. And that's because the Academy of Fine Arts existed there, which was a very prestigious art school. The Academy would have also facilitate the French Salon. This was the world's biggest exhibition in the Western art world. And so if you wanted to be a well-known artist, you wanted to submit your artwork to the French Salon so that you could get recognized. But only the elite were allowed into the academy. And so if you weren't making artwork that coincided with the style and like the subject matter that the academy or the academics were using, then you probably wouldn't get accepted into the school. And if you were submitting your artwork to the French Salon, you probably wouldn't get your artwork accepted. Just because you submit your artwork to an exhibition, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's accepted. And so people were kind of, organizing their artwork and making their artwork so that they could get into this big show. As far as the look, because it spans for such a long period, it does change a bit, like as time goes on. But just some kind of commonalities that we see within academic artwork. We see an idolized rural landscape, and poor lower class figures, particularly a lot of like very beautiful, young, barefoot girls, like in this painting that we see here. But again, I want to emphasize this is a very idolized, like very romanticized, not the way that it actually was. Like, this girl is clearly very posed. She's not out there really working, doing this manual labor that she is kind of insinuated to be doing. It's not as it actually looks. This is combining a lot of different sort of content or meanings, such as like from the neoclassical artists with the mythology and like the stories of the Roman Empire, the Romantic period as well, the Romanticism period with the drama and emotion and like exaggeration, like I said, or the idolization, and with the Rococo as well with the mythology aspects there. We see it, this as being very pretty, ideal imagery, something you might see on the back of an old-fashioned greeting card or the back of a church bulletin, for example. But again, just very pretty, idealized imagery, fairly realistic, sort of has some of those styles or like that crossover with like the Romanticism where there's a little bit looser brushwork. Not necessarily everything crisp and in focus like the neoclassical artist. And on the other end of the spectrum, happening between, this should say 1840s to 1870s. I'm sorry about that. If you go back to the very beginning, it would say that, but just caught that immediately. This is 19th century realism art, takes place between 1840s and 1870s. It comes from this idea of the artist wanting to capture real life. So, not meaning hyper realistic, that is a common misconception, but free from like the mystical landscapes and like biblical stories that don't really hold like, an actual thing that we can see in front of us. Um, so it's really wanting to capture those very real, very, unidolized scenes. It is influenced very heavily by politics because for so long in the academic world, we've seen this idolized version of like, very rural, very, poor people that are not being shown the way that they actually exist. And so these artists are trying to bring attention to um, the fact that they are this is not the way that they're actually existing. These people actually need more resources and more help. So, just like with the academic artist, these are scenes of mundane everyday life of poor common people. So, how do we know that this is a realism painting and not just specifically an academic painting? It depicts the harsh everyday reality of ordinary people from the middle and lower classes of society. It's a very sympathetic portrayal of the poor urban and rural workers, typically in their bent postures, struggling with hard manual labor. So this scene, it's very different, I think, between this one and this one, where she's just like very posed, like, is barefoot. And in this one, this woman is like actually working, and even back here, farther in like the middle left side, these are more women that are like, actually working and, experiencing hardship. And so that's what the realism painters wanted to do is just capture real life, real everyday life. Our next movement is the Pre-Raphaelite artwork, and it comes from 1848 to 1854. This comes from a group of artists who rejected the classical style of the renounced Renaissance artist Raphael. They had a disdain for the rise in Western Europe or European industrialization, like in the Romantic painters. But these artists looked at the past, like the Middle Ages and medieval art, as being a better time for art making. So, what did that look like? How do we know that pre-Raphaelite artwork is coming from that time period? I would say out of all the ones that we've talked about so far, pre-Raphaelite artwork is like the most easy to recognize immediately. It depicts women whose beauty is based on the real life mistresses and models of the English painter Dante Gabriel Rossetti, who is the founder of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood of Artists. These women were also very inspired by mythological and biblical stories and medieval tales, as well as Shakespearean stories. So there's not necessarily like one type of content they're interested in. But this woman, this redheaded, like long, very pretty hair, fair skin, blue green eyes, just, very beautiful, is usually always in the paintings. So there, if you see her, you know that it's coming from this pre-Raphaelite time. Typically, the women are doing or this woman, it could be multiple women as well, are doing very feminine, very like pretty, beautiful things like playing a harp in this piece here. There's always lots of florals and greenery, almost like the Rococo in a way. And I said down here it's painted in a harsh manner that seemed influenced by the Baroque, but with a softer, brighter palette. And I think I could have summarized that easier by just saying that it is very similar to the Rococo, where there's lots of flowers, lots of greenery, very intense lighting. Um, but it's very beautiful. It's very like amplifying the beauty in these women. And then lastly, we have Impressionism that goes on between 1870 and 1900, roughly. I'm just saying 1900, cutting it off there because that helps us with the timeline a bit, because everything after the 1900s is what we're going to label modern art. But it might be a little past then, like 1905-ish. Um, so the Impressionism period, it comes from these artists wanting to capture the impression of something. It's based on capturing scenes of fleeting moments, so like steam rising from a train, light flickering across the water, or sunset. It also comes from the development of the plein air painting that we see being used a lot. And this is plein air painting is when you would go out with like your painting stuff, your canvas, all of that, and you would paint from real life, like in an outdoor setting. This actually just comes from the invention of paint tubes, which I know that's kind of a silly thing, but or not, the idea of paint tubes, but that something as simple as paint tubes could allow for this. But before this time period, we don't have a way to transport paint. We only have to like, mix everything that we need at one time. We can't just, squirt out a little bit with our paint tube and use what we need and then cover the rest up. It's more of an involved process than that. It also comes from vacationing Parisians who sought these paintings as souvenirs from their travels outside of the city. So a lot of these painters would be, living on the coast or near a beach or near like a body of water. And there's a lot more people vacationing, weirdly enough, in this time period. More like middle class people, and not just like the very wealthy people could vacation and go on trips and things. With more resources that were provided to them. Is also another thing. This is a longer one than the other ones, but we talked early on in the painting lesson, I think that was lesson 9 maybe, about painting having a lot of near-death experiences. And this time period was definitely one of those because we start to see photography being pretty accessible to the everyday person. You could have your photograph or your portrait taken. Um, and so painters are like, okay, well, what do we do now that we have photography? How do we make painting something that it's not been before and still desirable? And so Impressionism, their goal was that they were capturing a different kind of feeling than the photographs could provide. And I know this is kind of it's a hard thing to really describe. I feel like in a sense you can feel it better. And so this is when I'm have my in-person classes, I always explain it in this way. So just humor me if you're, watching this at home or at school or wherever. Just take a minute and close your eyes. And I want you to try to picture a time where you were outside in the summer and there's a full moon. It's very, very bright, almost like the sun's out, but it's the moon. And there's just like this soft summer breeze coming through. The light from the moon is sort of like flickering through the trees. You can see like fireflies like lighting up the sky. And that starts to become more than just what you could, and you could open your eyes now if you're closing your eyes. That starts to become more than just something that you could like get from a photograph. Like you could take a picture in that moment, but it wouldn't make you feel the way that it feels being there. And so these impressionist artists were like, how can we make it feel like it when you are experiencing these things, these moments, these fleeting moments in life and in nature? So some qualities that make us feel that way, or that the impressionist artists try to use to make us feel that way, are thick dabs and blobs of paint, feeling that the artist finished the painting in a hurry, which was kind of intentional and kind of not intentional because they were doing the plein air paintings and they were painting, as these moments were actually fleeting by. like a sunset or a sunrise. But they also wanted it to feel like, that is a quick thing that happens. Watching a sunrise or watching the sunset, it just takes a few, minutes maybe to really feel that. And so, not having a clear outline sometimes kind of emphasize that more. There is no clear outline or many details, and it's meant to capture nature's fleeting moments and interplay between mist, fog, sunlight, clouds, and the water reflections. There's a focus on social life activities, recreation, and relaxation, so like boating, beaches, picnics, etc. And we actually looked at this painting one time before. This is Claude Monet's Impression Sunrise, and this is one of the first Impressionism paintings. The thing I like about this painting is that it does, I think, really capture, oh, in a way, the feeling that I was describing with the like being outside in the summer and, seeing the moonlight coming through the trees. But this is, again, it's depicting a sunrise, which is such a quick thing. And when you photograph it, it never really like, feels like it felt in that moment, the intensity that you get from it. But Claude Monet, he honed in on a couple things. I think one thing that you can really see here that's more so a feeling and it's hard to photograph necessarily, but when you're before the sunrise, there's sort of this, or, right when it's kind of just about to come up, there's sort of this blue filter on everything. It feels very cool still like in the night. And then very quickly as the sun rises, it feels like that sun is just so intense and vivid and orange in that moment. And then when it gets all the way up in the sky, it's, feels just kind of more general lighting. But right when it's rising, it's so orange and saturated, and it contrasts with that blue filter that still is kind of, covering everything. And so in this painting here, he's exaggerating the blues, and he's, kind of making it seem probably more blue than it actually was. And then really making that orange super, super saturated, playing with that emphasis and subordination here, using these little dabs of paint to show the water reflections. So yeah, I think he just really captures everything that we talked about just now about Impressionism in this painting. It makes you feel like you're there. It's not super detailed. And I think it just gives you more of the feeling of a sunrise than necessarily a photograph could. So that concludes our pre-modern art. In the next lesson, which I'm probably going to have to break up into two videos, unfortunately, we're going to cover modern art, and that will conclude our art history lesson. So hopefully this helped you a bit to get prepared for your final project, maybe got you thinking about some artwork that you wanted to investigate more on. I know it's sort of like a crash course in all of this, but if you did find one of these interesting, I would highly recommend using it for the final project so that you can do more research on it. But yeah, that concludes lesson 18, and I will see you guys next time for our final part.